So thank you very much for sticking around. And so yeah, I'm going to talk about Doppl. And as you might have guessed, Doppl is a cross-platform solution, as in, with a theme of the evening. So let me just get my speaker notes on. Okay. So Doppl is short for doppelganger, which, as probably a lot of you know, is a German word describing a person's duplication. The goal is an intro to Doppl. I'm not an expert in Doppl, so it's not a deep dive, and we haven't really got time to dive in too deeply. So I thought I'd show you what it is, show you some code, talk about some of the caveats around it, and talk about why you should care and why you should sort of take this solution seriously. In a nutshell, what it is Android-centric code sharing based off a Google library called Java to Objective-C. So some of you may have heard of this. It's been around for several years. Google used that primarily on their Sheets application. So they wrote complex spreadsheet logic in Java. They didn't want to rewrite it for iPhone, they didn't want to rewrite it for the web. So they developed this tool to allow them to cross-compile it, or to convert it, sorry. And they use JWT to convert that to JavaScript. So the same kind of same core code is running on the web as well as in the iPhone app. It's all kind of open source, Apache too. And what Doppl sort of does, because Java to Objective-C doesn't really help you at all. It's just there as a tool to use, but there's no kind of it's tough to get started in it, and that's where Doppl comes in. It's primarily a Gradle plugin, and it kind of pulls together your Java code, any other kind of stuff you have in your project, specific Doppl dependencies that have been sort of converted, that have kind of one-to-one mapping with dependencies that work in iOS. It pulls those together, crunches, goes through the conversion process for your Java code to Objective-C, and then boom, you've got effectively, you can include that code in your project just like as using Cocoa Pods, like a regular pod. So the kind of philosophy behind it, as some of you already kind of thinking, that it's not like a silver bullet or anything. It's not going to convert all your code, all your Java view stuff. So the sort of philosophy of Doppl is, if the user sees it, then you need to make that natively. Otherwise, you can make it once. That's the idea. The asterisk is there because that's not really true. Because it's really any kind of platform integration as well. You need to write natively as well. And the way I think of this is that it's any kind of interaction to your app, whether it be the user or whether it be like the platform. So I'm thinking like hardware integration, like Bluetooth, GPS, anything where you need, so like in an Android-centric world, like if you're dealing with scheduled jobs using like the alarm manager or a job scheduler, that's all stuff you're going to have to write natively. That's not something that you can share. It's too specific to the platform, so not something you can share using this sort of solution. So what can Doppl convert? What's it kind of good for? Really, it's based on what you're doing with your like modern app architecture. Matt touched on it a bit with MVVM and talked about some of the stuff you can convert there, like your models and your V models. But same with MVP, MVC, and clean. If you're the core kind of element of a lot of these architectures is separation. You want to separate your view code, your platform specific code, your UI stuff, away from your other kind of logic and business logic, so you can write unit tests or convert it to run on a different platform. So there's some of the things you can convert that work well. The repository pattern, if you're not familiar with that, it's kind of like a pattern you can use to kind of aggregate data. So you might have a repository in, say, a news app, and in your kind of presentation logic, you can say, hey, to the article repository, hey, get me some articles. And the repository handles where that comes from. It might give you some articles from the memory cache. It might go and get it from, if it's offline, there's no internet connection, it might talk to a SQLite database. or it might go off and get it from a remote API. The key thing is like all the logic for handling that is kind of hidden in the repository. I kind of like that from a, regardless of Doppl and all this, from an Android perspective, I think it's a really good pattern. But it's one of those things where you can kind of, for Doppl, completely write this in Java and convert it over and completely reuse that in iOS land. Things like view models and presenters. The idea, like I kind of said, is you're separating your the view, the GUI stuff out, so you can write them and convert them. And I'll show a code sample of that in a second. Any kind of like platform agnostic presenter, so if you're doing custom HTML, maybe you're rendering that in a web view, you could write the logic to do that in Java and then convert it with Doppl. And then sort of utility code, so like utility code is basically like mapping or transferring one data type to another. So like last year worked on a sports and fitness app, and we did lots of things with like calorific conversions and working out how much energy you burn and stuff depending on your heart rate and what your height and weight was and stuff like that. And it was all kind of set formulas, and we had to implement them on both platforms, twice, and write tests for them twice. And whereas with this, we could have wrote it in Java first, written unit tests, and then just convert it over and used it in Objective-C in iOS. It would have been easy. So those are some of the things you can do. So it's not trying to be the silver bullet. It's not trying to be the write once, run everywhere. But there's core components there that you could see. Oh, that would work in both. And if you separate it out, it kind of works. From an Android library support point of view, you've got support for the architecture components, which is, if you're unfamiliar, the architecture components are Google's kind of more opinionated way of how you should architect apps, which kind of went to, I think it was announced at I/O in May, but it's just recently gone to version 1. I would imagine a lot of new apps are going to follow those kind of patterns. RX Java 2, so you can keep things reactive. And things like retrofit and OKHTTP, you kind of de facto libraries that you use for any kind of API, any API access. It's got support for Room, which is was released with the architecture components, but it's not sort of technically part of them. SQL Cipher for Android, so you can have an encrypted database, and it has testing support with Mockito. The reason why I put that up is that's the sort of supported libraries. You can add your own support for libraries. But in terms of if I was starting a new Android project today, they would be like the first libraries that I would put in. May not be the same for everyone here, but I think for a lot of people, those are well used, and if those weren't supported, they might be a reason to opt out of this kind of technology. So let's look at the code. So I forgot to say, I kind of found out about Doppl at Droidcon New York, where I was giving a talk, and they released the conference app as an open source app. It's the most comprehensive open source app using Doppl, and it's I'll show you a link to it in a sec. But this is basically the details page of a talk. You can see it looks different on both on the two different simulators, and I'm going to sort of talk you through just briefly the kind of like view controller, the fragment, and the layout for these pages. It all kind of relies on the fact that this kind of host interface, I don't know why they called it host, there's probably a reason, but as I said, this isn't a deep dive, so but the point is here is that this is your view model. You're going to do something generic like data refresh, and you're going to get some generic sort of non-platform specific event information. These are just plain sort of object. This is in Java, but could easily be in Objective-C. It's just an object. You've got a callback or a method when there's an error, and then you've got another action for RSVP. So this is kind of an interface which the view has to implement, and then you implement your kind of view specific stuff. So in Android land and in a fragment, you can see we've overridden the data refresh part. We're taking that event information and just updating various content on the page. I've kind of excluded that because you don't really just so it would fit on one page. But you can see it's getting data from that event info. It's changing the colour of the page based on the category, and it's updating the content, the speaker information, and stuff like that. Again, the error, it's just showing up a fairly noddy kind of toast, but you can see that it's handled in a however you want to handle it on Android. Same with the RSVP sort of action. And if we switch over to how do you do it? That's a good point. So you've got that, you've got your Android project all kind of working. Do you want to convert it to iOS? So you download the Doppl runtime. There's a Gradle task called Doppl build. You run that, it converts your code over, and then you just do a pod install and then open up the it's a framework file, and then that's it. You've loaded it up in Xcode, and then if you were looking at that event details example, you'd see the event details view controller, and again we see the same methods. We see it's implementing the host interface, and then we're implementing the data refresh. We're doing some stuff, getting the data out. Again, updating the view. And this is probably a bit weird looking for Objective-C people, for iOS people. So there's definitely, I'll probably say it about 10 times in a minute, but it's Android centric. So there is definitely a bit of a rub on the sort of this side. But you can see the kind of idea. You're implementing the view, and you're implementing those methods, but the kind of like view model behind it was only written once. So the rough edges, there's definitely stuff in Java you can do that can cause memory kind of issues, memory and reference counting issues. So you definitely need to run Xcode. I guess it uses a linting tool or something like that to check for reference counting. The runtime size is 15 meg, which is like a couple of years ago that would have been like a deal breaker for some, but nowadays, certainly in my experience, iOS apps seem to be more like 100 meg rather than like 10 meg compared with an Android app of an equivalent sort of feature set. Like that could be a totally biased outlook, but that's certainly what I see. So to me, 15 meg, it doesn't seem a big deal. Debugging is a bit flaky. As I said, it's kind of Android centric, and you can get the code that you can go and look at. I think you can do this in Xcode. There's a way of seeing what the Java code was of the Objective-C code, so you can see what it was pre-conversion. But certainly the code it creates, you're not going to be you're not meant to be changing that because it's generated, but it's probably not going to be that pretty. There's no support for Swift and Kotlin, which is kind of a shame, but that Java to Objective-C library was out years ago, before these kind of languages even were first-class citizens. You can still interop with them. Kotlin and Java interop extremely well, and you can still call Objective-C code from Swift, and they're looking at making that even easier. But you can still, there's still interop there. You just can't convert it. It's in tech preview, so it isn't a mature product. They're looking to bring it to some kind of what's after tech preview? Probably alpha, maybe. I don't know. Whatever the next stage is, whatever makes you feel more comfortable using it. I don't know. The other thing that's worth noting is that the guys behind it are a company called TouchLab. And you may know TouchLab. They're a New York-based apps development company. Used to be primarily Android. Now they do iOS as well. So you can see the background. Their technical expertise is Android, and they've come up with this solution on top of this existing technology to sort of help them deliver iOS apps. So they use it for client work. They use it in production, but they are the only kind of company that are kind of pushing this. There isn't much stuff out on the web and internet about it. which is partly why I wanted to do this talk, because I saw this and thought, oh, this could be quite interesting. There's definitely aspects here that could be definitely useful. So it's not got like, you know, with Dave's talk we saw Flutter's got, you know, Google's backing, and they're pushing it. They are pushing it. React Native with Facebook, and Xamarin, you know, with Microsoft backing. Yeah, there's nothing. It is a huge company, so there's nothing to stop them just dropping technologies. We saw Facebook drop Pars.com a couple of years back, you know, and that had lots of users. So you're not necessarily safer because there's a big company behind it, but you know, depending on your, you know, who you work for, you know, that big name behind it could make a big difference whether it's the technology you adopt. So, like getting started, go to doppl.co. There's Twitter, there's a Slack group, a Stack Overflow tag, and that's a link to the Droidcon example. I didn't have time to show sort of too much code, but it's worth having a nose around that. The slides are uploaded on Speaker Deck. There's a link to that at the end as well. But yeah, the Droidcon example is really the one to look at. That's got all the uses the new libraries, and that's kind of a more better example of how it would look in the real world. So I kind of sped through this because I'm conscious of we all want to get to the pub or go home. So like I saw this and thought this is, you know, interesting, because like, you know, I can still write apps in Android. I think it's, you know, it works for iOS devs too, because you know you can write your repositories and your utilities and your view models and stuff. Some of that is fairly boring. I mean, certainly like repository stuff is boring. If you can write that once and then convert it, you know, if you're an iOS kind of native developer, you can focus on, you know, native integrations, you know, Face ID, Touch ID, or making the app, you know, really sing with awesome animations, you know, do the fun stuff, and just reuse the boring stuff. That's kind of what spoke to me anyway. The other things that why you guys might care as well is that generally I would say like native tools and native SDK wins if you're going to. If I was just writing an Android app, it's only ever going to be an Android. You know, I mean, I'm biased, but I would choose. You know, you choose Android Studio and the Android SDK. You'd be almost stupid not to, because of the amount of developers, the amount of money that's gone into those tools and that SDK, and the amount of people using them. Same on iOS. If you're just doing it for iOS, it would be a hard argument to justify doing it in anything other than Xcode and using the iPhone SDKs. You could probably argue it if your background is solely in JavaScript, then there might be some argument there. But in general, like from a business point of view, you know, that's where the money's been spent, and that's where that's why I feel those kind of tools win. I think the key thing is you can share a little bit or you can share a lot. We talked about some things you couldn't share, like view stuff, but there's a lot of things that I think make a good argument to share, like repositories, utilities, and things like that. And there's also this kind of pressure around, because of, I mean, this whole meetup is kind of about this kind of pressure, and a thing that different people in the industry are talking about around cost cutting, around these technologies like React Native, and management people hear these things and, you know, go to the website and see it can do all these cool things. And rightly or wrongly, you know, some of us at the companies we work for are going to be pressurized into using cross-platform, whether we like it or not. Whether it's the right technical decision or not is just going to be the way you know, companies work. So I kind of see this as it's like a way of kind of doing something in the right direction. If you can, and you don't have to learn JavaScript, you know. You know, you could do this kind of, you know, it meets them halfway. It's very much like from a management perspective. You know, can we write this, you know, this repository, this utility class, these bits, and then convert them, and just write. I totally glossed over it, but like with Mockito, you can write it and write all your tests as well. So your test suite is also is converted, so you can run your test suite on both, you know, in Java as well as in Objective-C. You know, write those bits once, and then, you know, brings down some of that cost. So, like I say, I don't think it's a silver bullet, I just thought there were some interesting parts there which, if you've already got an Android app, or you're leading with that app like you totally always should, but yeah, there might be some things which you can save the iOS guys doing the boring stuff and just let them do the fun stuff. So yeah, that's pretty much it. I just wanted to share that. Thanks for listening.